Hello, welcome to my video blog where we sit at the intersection of faith, LGBT, and Christian communities. Today I want to talk to you about the second part of Romans 1. The first part I talked about the exchange and pagan worship. The second part I'm going to actually talk about nature and also who is this actually applying to. So verse 24 and on, or actually 26 and on. For this reason, God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise, also men, leaving the natural use of women, burned in their lust for one another, men with men committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the due penalty of their error. So here, in order to really understand this verse, we have to go to understand what natural use meant. Now, there have actually been several understandings of this, and the modern one is homosexuality and heterosexuality. Now, this is actually not the first use. The early church actually believed the natural use of women was to serve men. So let's read it with that inflection. For even their women exchanged the natural use of serving men for what is against nature, and likewise the men, leaving the natural use of being served by women, burned in their lust for one another, men committing with men what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the due penalty of their error. So that's an anti-feminist interpretation, and that's how they changed what natural use meant here, and understood natural use here. And I don't think it's the right interpretation, but that's how the early church saw this. In fact, they did not actually see lesbianism implicated until about the 5th century from this verse. So I also want to talk about the other interpretation from this verse, and it leads to the Catholic understanding of birth control. Now, Catholics believe birth control is biblical, or not biblical, and goes against this verse. So, and they get here because the natural use of women was discussed by Plato, and that meant procreation. So I'm going to read this verse with the idea of procreation in mind. For this reason, God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the procreative use for what is against nature, or procreation. Likewise, the men, leaving the procreative use of women, burned in their lust for one another, men with men committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves a due penalty of their error. So here, non-procreative sex, and using men towards that end instead of women, because women you always had a problem or a possibility. The focus is entirely different with that reading, and this is actually kind of the Middle Ages. This is how they viewed homosexuality, and that understanding is it was incidental to not wanting to have kids. So it changes how we actually look at what's going on. Next, natural use. This word nature in Romans 2 is used to mean instinct, because Gentiles by instinct are doing the will of God. So let's read it with that in mind. For even the women exchange the instinctual for use for what is against instinct, and likewise the men, leaving the instinct of use of women, burned in their lust for one another, men committing with men what is shameful, and receiving in themselves a due penalty of this error. So this type of interpretation actually lends itself to, say, heterosexual men doing homosexual things is actually sinful and shameful. This actually does not necessarily apply to those whose instincts are towards the same sex, because it just doesn't. And if in Romans 2 we go by the conscience as the king and guide of instinct, and Gentiles who do instinctually do the will of God, we have to think what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If it means fidelity in relationships, if it means mutual love and such, that's not necessarily a bad thing but maybe it is when it is against nature and it is against instinct and it is against your conscience. These are all things that are neither safe to go against, but it changes the view of it from homosexuality carte blanche to something else. And so those are three possible interpretations outside of homosexuality and men with men, and natural use just being flat out sex. So the thing is, these different interpretations are not without warrant and not totally invalid, and some of them are traditional interpretations. And if you really say you're standing with tradition against homosexuality, are you also standing with tradition against birth control? Are you also standing with tradition against anti-feminism? Are you also, in even those verses, and make lesbianism disappear? Even those interpretations, traditional interpretations. And so there's a giant question mark that shows up, and what we have to really come to is, who is this due penalty really applying to? So I want to continue on. Even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, other words, rape or exploitation, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, unloving, untrustworthy, unforgiving, unmerciful, who know the righteous judgment of God, and that those who practice such things are deserving of death. Not only do the same, but also prove those who practice them. So if we look at this list, this is a list of vice. And in fact, the Stoics believed if you acted against nature, you would incur vice. So that is the due penalty, is vice, if it's talking about nature and the Stoic understanding of it. So if we look at this list of who has these characteristics, I would end up saying those who worship darkness and those who abuse children have this list. And abuse those who are not able to consent and are not of the age that they can understand what they're getting themselves into. So the point being is, then Romans 1 turns on it and says that the Jews, even though they have the law, are not following it. So the Jews are doing the very same thing. So if you kind of say that this is about homosexuality and the Gentiles and them going against what is instinctual, God later says that the conscience is the king and that the instinct to do the will of God is king. And if these qualities are not necessarily in the homosexual or the gay person or the LGBT, they were once alleged to be, and we're actually finding that it's pretty false, especially when you're talking to a 30-year-old virgin sitting in front of you. So, I guess in conclusion, if this list doesn't necessarily fit, then why are you really continuing to apply it to homosexuals? And how are you applying the sinner section to homosexuals, verse 26 and 27? And furthermore, what is shameful is not necessarily sinful, and what is descriptive, in other words, is talking about the Gentiles who are worshiping their deities in this way, is not really proscriptive, in other words, we should not do this at all, then there is an issue here that maybe this isn't actually talking about homosexuality as its primary purpose, but it's incidental again. In fact, the ancient world did not necessarily see homosexuality as a separate thing, And it really is a modern understanding that it is. But finally, my opinion is that what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Now, if that means fidelity, yes, that's good for everyone. And we have spent too much time talking about who you are with rather than how you are with them. And we have spent too little time talking about the character of a person and their heart for God versus who they are with, which is external. And we have ignored their heart for God by not allowing them to serve or be welcomed in an affirming community. So what has happened is I believe God is being put to the test because he puts his spirit into these people, or the LGBT, just like everyone else, and they're turning to God, but they're being given these heavy burdens. And God is being put to the test, like Acts 15:10. And this burden is larger than what other people's parents and fathers had to deal with. So, in conclusion, I guess we need to really think about what is this verse actually saying and who is it applying to. And I no longer believe it actually applies to the LGBT. I'll leave you with that.